John stared at the moving boxes scattered around his new, small apartment. 18 years. 18 years he'd spent walking on eggshells, trying to please someone who was never pleased. He was finally free of Sarah, his narcissistic wife, but freedom felt strange, like a limb that had been asleep for too long, tingling and unfamiliar. He'd expected euphoria, a rush of liberation. Instead, he felt like a deflated balloon. His therapist had explained it. Narcissistic survivor's syndrome, she'd called it. He was learning his emotional and mental muscles had atrophied, weakened by years of manipulation and control. One of the first things he noticed was the overwhelming feeling of being wrong. Even choosing what to eat felt like a high-stakes gamble. Sarah had always criticized everything, his clothes, his music, his friends. Now, even without her voice, the internalized critic echoed in his head. He'd buy a shirt, then immediately second-guess it, wondering if it was too loud or too boring. He'd start a conversation, then stop mid-sentence, sure he was going to say something foolish. Then there were the boundaries. He was used to having none. Sarah had demanded every moment of his attention. Now, when a friend called to hang out, John felt an almost crippling sense of obligation and guilt if he wasn't immediately available. He found himself saying yes to things he didn't want to do, just to avoid the internal turmoil. His therapist had to remind him, "John, you have a right to say no." It seemed like a foreign concept. Dating was a minefield. He'd meet someone nice, someone genuinely interested in him, and he'd find himself waiting for the other shoe to drop. He'd brace himself for criticism, for the subtle put-downs he'd grown accustomed to. He'd analyze every word, every gesture, looking for hidden meanings and ulterior motives. He couldn't quite believe that not every interaction was a power game. It was exhausting. One evening, he decided to finally listen to the mountain of vinyl records he'd hoarded over the years. Sarah had always called his music noise. As the music filled his small apartment, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Joy. Small, quiet, but finally there. It was a reminder that he had a self, a John, that existed outside of Sarah's influence. His journey wasn't a straight line. He'd have good days, days where he felt strong and confident. Then he'd get a text message from Sarah, a casual, "How are you?" And suddenly he'd be thrown back to that old familiar place of anxiety and doubt. He'd find himself wondering if he was the problem, if he'd made the wrong choices. Could he ever truly escape her grasp, even now that she was gone? John learned to recognize these moments. He learned to breathe. He learned that he didn't have to answer every text, every call. He started talking to his friends honestly about everything that happened in his marriage. He discovered they were far more supportive and understanding than he ever thought possible. He also decided to volunteer at a local animal shelter. Being around animals who needed love and offered it so freely healed a part of him he hadn't even realized was broken. He realized healing wasn't about forgetting or about pretending he hadn't been hurt. It was about acknowledging the pain, learning from it, and finding the strength to move forward, even if sometimes he stumbled. One day, he met a woman named Emily at the shelter. She was kind, gentle, and incredibly patient. He was terrified of getting hurt again, but something about her felt different. He found himself saying things he'd never said to anyone before, and for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. He still caught himself doubting her sincerity, still questioned her motives, but he was learning to trust his own instincts, to recognize when his past was trying to sabotage his present. He understood that true healing, truly moving on, was a balancing act, protecting himself while still opening himself to possibility. How could he protect himself and still learn to trust? The answer, he realized, was to trust himself first. That was the key. John's story was a reminder that surviving narcissistic abuse is a journey, a challenging mountain to climb. But it's a journey that is possible, and there is always hope for a future filled with genuine connection and joy. The world was full of possibilities, and John, step by painful step, was ready to explore them. If you or someone you know is a survivor of narcissistic abuse, know that you are not alone. Seek support, set boundaries, and take the time you need to heal. And remember, true healing and growth can only begin when we learn to love and value ourselves. Together, we can break free from the chains of narcissistic abuse and reclaim our lives. If you agree, then drop a heart in the comments. If you also have faced a similar situation and managed to overcome it, do share in the comments.